This week I've got Shazam, which is based on a DC Comics character, but in terms of movies, the film actually feels more like a Marvel movie than the DC movies we've seen of late, because DC films tend to be darker and grittier and, oh, my whole planet was blown up and, oh, my parents were killed, or, oh, my mom is named Martha, and this is not really that level of kind of angst and darkness. Even visually, it's a brighter film. There's a lot of bright colors in this. So the idea is that the mantle or character, I guess, of Shazam, and I will admit I knew nothing about Shazam going into it. Really, to me, Shazam is only the inspiration for Kazam, the great movie starring Shaquille O'Neal. But anyway, so Djimon Honsu plays a wizard who's named Shazam, and he is searching for a hero to take on the mantle of his power to prevent the 7 deadly sins from ruining the earth. I think I got that right. I hope so. It feels very convoluted to even describe. And so what ends up happening, and this is not a spoiler because it's in the trailers, but what ends up happening is that he finds like a 13 or 14-year-old kid named Billy Batson, who's a runaway foster kid, this and that, who's just been placed in a new home and all this stuff. And he finds this kid and he passes his power to them. And when Billy Batson says Shazam, he turns into this superhuman, basically Superman-esque, fully grown adult who is being played by Zachary Levi. Levy? So it's, Zachary Levi is playing this like childlike character. I think he does a good job of, I'll call it big syndrome, where you're an adult playing embodying the spirit of a younger child. And he has kind of the enthusiasm for it. And then the baddie, in addition to the 7 deadly sins, because those are apparently the baddies, is played by Mark Strong, who I think is such a great actor, but so wasted here. And then there's like the throwaway villains in this are so terrible. And also the way they represent the 7 deadly sins, it's like, I want to see them actually represent the sin that they are named for, but they all just kind of look like these homogenous monstery creatures. Like if I see gluttony, I want it to be this like super oversized fat thing. If I see wrath, I want it to be like on fire and, just constantly angry with horns or something like that. But no, they're all these kind of like goblin-y looking things. And they didn't even bother to give them like lip sync animation. They just kind of like talk with their minds telepathically, which is whatever. So Mark Strong is allied with the 7 deadly sins and is the nemesis to Shazam essentially in this. And again, it's like, I don't know anything about the lore. He may have been an important character. He may not. Does it really matter? No. And this is actually a thing that I will fully acknowledge that Marvel movies tend to suffer from the most, and DC movies are actually slightly better about. And this is also why this made this feel more like a Marvel movie in some senses, is that the villain was throwaway. Because like DC Comics has some of the best villains, right? You've got your Jokers, you've got your Harley Quinns, basically any of the Batman villains are amazing. Lex Luthor, in various iterations. And then you've got, this is something that Marvel movies tend to fall short on. And this is one of those moments where I was like, yeah, this feels like it fell short on the motivation and like how are they connected to each other. It's just sort of like, oh, there's a crazy guy trying to unleash evil into the world. Okay, cool, whatever. So the other thing I was very worried about with this movie was that it was going to skew very young. Because if you've seen the trailers, there's a kid, I don't even remember what the dance is called, but flossing. The kid, it shows Zachary Levi flossing, which is something a 14-year-old would do. And, a lot of it relies on like, oh, going viral and like YouTube videos and this and that. And it also feels like that is immediately going to date this film. Like in 5 years, everyone's going to be like, what? How did they find out about this guy? Okay, it doesn't matter. So for the most part, I would say it somewhat avoids it, or it uses it to its advantage. There's some very funny scenes about like, oh, well, what would you do if you were a 14-year-old and suddenly you could get away with doing like being an adult? And so that I thought it did a great job of. The dynamic between the younger 14-year-old Billy Batson and his foster siblings, that, while feeling accurate at times to sibling interactions and like teenage angst and stuff like that, that's where it got a little grating. His foster brother's named Freddie, and the two of them like kind of butt heads a lot, and it gets a little screamy and like unnecessarily so, and I was kind of over it. Anyway, for the most part, I enjoyed the movie. I thought the third act was pretty weak. This is also the thing. Shazam and Superman, and actually to a degree like Captain Marvel, all suffer from what I call a little bit, I call it Superman syndrome, in that they are so powerful and so strong as characters that they're going to win. And so it's like, oh, okay, well, I need them to find ways to make it feel perilous, to make it feel like, actually, no, there is a risk, there are stakes involved, and I don't know if the third act of Shazam really succeeded at that. So overall, again, I had very low expectations going in, so it exceeded those, but everyone's being like, oh, it's the greatest, oh, it's the best. I was like, no, it's fine. It's a slightly different spin on a superhero origin story than we've seen of late, just because it does involve like, hey, if a kid became a superhero. but for the most part, it's still pretty generic. And also, there are certainly references to the rest of the DC universe, and, like, you see, like, Batman paraphernalia and, like, Superman stuff, and they, like, idolize Superman. So I'm like, when does this take place in their Justice League timeline? Also, it feels, the way it works into that universe kind of feels weird, where it's like, okay, well, have the events of those movies impacted these people? They're talking about them in a very cavalier sense, and I didn't love that. If you're going to do this, like, an encompassing, this is something that Marvel does a great job of, right? Where it's like, oh, no, this is one cohesive universe. I don't think DC has accomplished that yet. And look, not everything has to be comparison between the two of them. It's very easy to compare the two because they are the titans of comics. And we have seen so many superhero films in the last however many years. But it's an origin story. You know, there are certainly slightly more unique characteristics to it because of the whole, like, young person transforming thing. But it's not the most amazing thing in the world. And I think, like, if I watched it again, I'd be like, no, thank you. So it's good for a one watch. I don't think the repeat value is going to be amazing. I think if you're a huge Shazam fan, it seems like it does a decent job of doing right by the fandom, but I certainly cannot speak to that. Again, this is my other thing. In addition to it being sort of unclear as to when this takes place in the DC universe, the other thing is, like, are you trying to set up a sequel? If that is the case, there are certainly a lot more questions I have that I'm like, I don't know how you're going to do this, but okay. I don't know if I'd particularly care to see it, which is its own issue, right? But if it's trying to be a self-contained film, then I'm like, oh, okay. All right, no problem. Cool. So I'm going to give it 3.7 out of 5. Fine for a one watch through. There's not a ton else coming out this weekend, but I don't think it's going to have a super historic place in cinematic superhero history.